The Last Flame, the Rise and Fall of the Knights Templar. Introduction. On a cold March evening in the year 1314, an old man stood bound to a wooden stake on the Île aux Juifs, the Jewish island, in the heart of Paris. He was 70 years old, his beard white, his robes torn. Around him, executioners arranged bundles of wood soaked in pitch. The crowd was silent. Then the torch came. As the flames rose to consume him, the old man raised his voice, not in prayer, but in prophecy. Pope Clement, King Philip, Knight Guillaume de Nogaret. Within the year I summon you to God's judgment. I curse you, all of you, and your bloodline to the 13th generation. His name was Jacques de Molay, and with his death, an era ended. He was the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar. An order once so powerful, it stood above kings, beyond borders, beneath only God. In its time, it was a bank, an army, a secretive brotherhood, and a myth in the making. What destroyed it? Greed, fear, or something far older? The eternal tension between power and faith, wealth and principle, loyalty and betrayal. This is the story of the Templars, their birth in the deserts of Jerusalem, their rise through war and gold, their fall in smoke and flame. It begins not with a curse, but with a pilgrimage. To understand why the last flame was lit, we must walk the long road that led to it. Let us begin our journey into the past, together with Bedtime Lectures. If you enjoy falling asleep to stories like this, don't forget to subscribe, tap the bell, and let us know in the comments what story you'd like to hear next. Chapter 1. The Origins of the Templar Order. In the early 12th century, the world trembled with holy ambition. From the cloisters of European cathedrals to the dusty roads of the Levant, a new fervor had taken root in Christendom. The First Crusade had come and gone like a firestorm. Preached from pulpits and carried on banners, it had called upon knights and peasants alike to reclaim the Holy Land from the hands of the infidel. And against all odds, it had succeeded, at least in appearance. In 1199, after a long and brutal campaign, the Crusaders took Jerusalem. The streets ran with blood, the air choked with smoke. But amid the horror, a new kingdom was born, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, ruled not by Muslims, not by Jews, but by Latin Christians, foreign lords transplanted into a land they scarcely understood. Other Crusader states, Tripoli, Antioch, Edessa, soon followed, forming a thin Christian veneer across a region that remained deeply fractured and dangerous. The holy city might have been taken, but the road to it was not safe. Pilgrims, drawn by faith and tales of miracle, poured into the east, hoping to kneel before the Holy Sepulchre. Many never arrived. They were robbed, beaten, murdered. For the deserts and mountains between ports like Acre and the gates of Jerusalem were filled with bandits, deserters, and remnants of the defeated armies who had not forgotten their rage. It was in this moment, somewhere between victory and vulnerability, that a French knight named Hugues de Payens stepped forward with an idea as radical as it was humble. Hugues was not a prince. He was not even particularly wealthy, but he was devout, and he had seen the need. Alongside a small group of like-minded men, some say 9, others say 18, he approached Baldwin II, the King of Jerusalem, with a simple proposal. Let us guard the pilgrims. Let us take no pay. Let us live in poverty. We will give our lives to protect the faithful as they walk these blood-soaked roads. Baldwin, embattled and in need of every ally, agreed. He gave the knights quarters in what was believed to be the former site of the Temple of Solomon, a sacred ruin known in Arabic as Al-Aqsa. From this, their name was born, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, or more simply, the Knights Templar. They were not yet famous, not yet feared, not yet rich. But in their vow of poverty, in their strange dual identity, both monk and warrior, they planted the seed of something that would change the medieval world. They wore white cloaks, later emblazoned with a red cross, a symbol of martyrdom and sacrifice. Their rule was severe: no women, no private possessions, no softness of flesh or finery. Their lives would be structured around prayer, combat, and discipline. They were not monks who had taken up swords. They were swords that had embraced the monastery. For a time, they were little more than a curiosity, strange holy warriors in a land already thick with contradiction. But in the years that followed, the legend began to grow. Bernard of Clairvaux, a towering figure in the church, lent them his support. A Cistercian monk, mystic, and reformer, Bernard wrote passionately in their defense. He described them not as violent, but as sanctified. A new kind of knighthood, he said, holy, just, necessary. With Bernard's blessing came legitimacy. In 1129, at the Council of Troyes, the Templars received their official rule. It was based in part on Cistercian monasticism, rigid, minimal, exacting. In 1139, Pope Innocent II issued a bull, Omni Datum Optimum, granting the Templars extraordinary privileges. They were placed under the direct authority of the Pope, exempt from local laws, free from taxes, able to travel across borders at will. They had become untouchable, and with this divine protection, they grew. Knights from across Europe began to join their ranks, not only poor men seeking honor, but nobles, warriors, sons of lords. To take the Templar vow was to shed one's name and become part of something larger, a crusade that did not end with a single war, but continued daily in armor and in prayer. Gifts of land poured in, donations of gold, vineyards, mills, and castles. Mothers gave their sons. Kings gave their blessings. The Templars spread from the Holy Land into France, England, Spain, Italy. They became a network, a military, religious, and financial engine fueled by faith and fear. But at the heart of it all was that first image, a dusty road, a pilgrim in danger, and a knight in white armor standing silently at his side. That was the mission. That was the beginning. In the next chapter, we will enter the walls of the temple itself and explore what life was truly like for those who lived not for glory, but for sacrifice. Chapter 2. Monks in Armor. Life inside the temple. To join the Templar order was not to become a soldier, it was to become a weapon. A Templar was not born. He was forged in silence, obedience, and steel. For behind the glory of battles and the mystique of secrets, the life inside the temple was one of relentless austerity. No wealth, no family, no indulgence. Just prayer, command, and war. A knight of the temple lived by the rule. Written with the guidance of Bernard of Clairvaux, the rule governed everything: how to eat, how to pray, how to sleep, how to fight. There were 72 original clauses, later expanded to over 600. It was not a suggestion, it was law, and it was harsh. Templars rose before dawn. They prayed in darkness, armored themselves in silence, and trained without rest. The day was divided between martial drills, physical labor, religious devotion, and the business of the order. Meals were simple: bread, wine, water, perhaps a bit of meat on feast days. Talking was discouraged. Laughter was rare. They slept clothed, not out of modesty, but out of readiness, in case the horn blew at night, in case the call to arms came. And when they slept, it was never in darkness. A candle always burned. Light was protection. Light was purity. Light kept the devil at bay. They took 3 vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience. To break any was not sin. It was betrayal. There were no wives, no children, no embraces, not even a mother's kiss. The rule forbade contact with women. A knight was to love only Christ, to serve only the mission. Celibacy was not a virtue, it was armor for the soul. Discipline was absolute. Infractions were punished with ferocity. A knight who raised his voice could be denied communion. One who disobeyed could be flogged publicly. One who fled from battle could be expelled and dishonored for life. The worst punishment was exile, not only from the order, but from God. And still, men lined up to join. Why? Because within this rigidity was something rare: purpose. A knight knew his place. He knew what to do. He was not part of a corrupt court, not a pawn of politics, not a wandering blade. He served something bigger. The Templar hierarchy was tight and efficient. At the top stood the Grand Master, commander of the entire order. He held absolute authority in war and peace. Beneath him, the seneschal managed logistics. The marshal led troops in battle. The draper managed the robes and arms. The commander of Jerusalem and his counterparts in Tripoli and Antioch oversaw eastern provinces. In Europe, the order was divided into provinces, each province into priories, each priory into commanderies, each commandery into houses. Each Templar house was a small fortress of discipline, a local cell in the great body of the temple. Within these walls lived knights, sergeants, and squires. The knights wore white with a red cross, the color of blood, the color of martyrdom. Sergeants wore black or brown. They were not of noble birth, but they were warriors, and they fought with equal ferocity. The banner of the order, black and white, flew over every battlefield. It symbolized life and death. The standard-bearer, or gonfalonier, was one of the most honored knights. If he fell, if the banner was taken, chaos followed. And yet the Templars rarely broke. They were known to fight to the death, to hold ground beyond reason. Retreat was forbidden. Surrender, shameful. The rule demanded courage not as valor, but as duty. Their seal showed two knights on one horse, a symbol, they said, of poverty and brotherhood. Others whispered different meanings, of secrets, of vows more complex than scripture. But officially, the image was humility. Templars were forbidden to touch gold, to own private property, to speak unnecessarily. They did not gamble. They did not hunt for sport. Their joy was in duty. And yet, in the midst of this monastic rigor, they became rich, powerful, political. That contradiction would later be used against them. But in the early years, in the quiet cloisters and sun-baked fortresses, they were what they claimed to be, monks in armor. Their lives were hard. Their days were measured. Their nights were watched. Their deaths, often brutal. And they chose it freely. In the next chapter, we will watch these armored monks march to war, not as hired blades, but as God's own fury, as the disciplined elite of a holy cause that would one day consume them. Chapter 3. The War Machine of Christ. When the world burned, the Templars did not watch. They advanced. Their white cloaks were banners in the dust, their crimson crosses soaked in blood. If the order was forged in discipline, it was tempered in war. And the wars never stopped. From the moment of their founding, the Templars were more than guardians. They were warriors, elite, unrelenting, and absolutely unafraid to die. Not for gold, not for kings, but for something they believed to be greater. The Holy Land was never at peace. It was a mosaic of truces and betrayals, of alliances made by day and broken by night. The Templars learned quickly that idealism had no place in battle. What mattered was survival and victory. They fought at Al-Buqayya in 1163, facing the forces of Nur ad-Din, a brilliant Muslim emir. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, the Franks were nearly routed, but the Templars held. Their discipline, their formation, their refusal to break, their faith turned chaos into cohesion. They were the line that would not bend. In 1177, they joined Baldwin IV, the Leper King, in a daring attack at the Battle of Montgisard. With a force of barely 500 knights and a handful of Templars, they shattered the army of Saladin, one of the most revered commanders of the Islamic world. It was a miracle, a moment of divine madness, and the legend of the warrior monks grew stronger. But legends have their limits. In 1187, the world turned. Saladin returned with fury and vengeance. At the Horns of Hattin, the Christian army met its doom. The heat was merciless. The water was gone. Surrounded and exhausted, they were crushed. The Templars fought to the last. Those captured were executed or sold. The defeat shattered the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem. Within months, the city was lost, the temple itself gone, and still, they fought. The order did not retreat, it repositioned. Acre, Tyre, Tripoli became new fortresses, new front lines. The Templars adapted. They turned their experience into doctrine, their setbacks into lessons. They built castles that seemed to grow from rock, bristling with walls and towers, able to withstand years of siege. Yet as they hardened, they also changed. They made alliances, sometimes with Muslim leaders, sometimes with rival Christian factions. Politics crept in, compromise became necessary. The enemy was not always clear, and neither was the cause. At times, they betrayed their oath of simplicity. At times, they killed fellow Christians. At times, they were mercenaries in all but name. By the end of the 13th century, the world around them had shifted. The Crusader ideal had decayed. The East was tired of invaders. Europe, tired of sacrifice. The flow of fresh recruits slowed. The zeal faded. And then came Acre. In 1291, the last great Crusader stronghold fell. It was the end of the Latin East. The siege was apocalyptic. Catapults hurling stone and fire, walls trembling, civilians screaming. The Templars held the lines as long as they could, covering the evacuation, standing their ground until their own fortress collapsed upon them. Those who escaped fled by sea. Those who remained died. The fall of Acre was not just a military defeat. It was the end of an era, the death of the Templars' original mission. No more pilgrims to protect, no more holy land to hold. And yet, they survived. They returned to Europe with something greater than glory. They returned with wealth, with land, with influence. They had become a network of castles, treasuries, and commanderies that stretched from Scotland to Sicily. But without a battlefield, what is a warrior? Without a cause, what is a crusader? The Templars had become something strange. No longer the monks of Jerusalem. No longer the special forces of Christendom. They were something else. And that, perhaps, was their greatest sin. In the next chapter, we will follow the transformation. How the Templars, forged in fire and bound by faith, became a power unto themselves. A power too large, too wealthy, and ultimately too dangerous to survive. Chapter 4. A State Within States. When the Templars returned from the Holy Land, they came not as refugees, but as something stranger. They came as ghosts of a lost crusade, cloaked not in glory, but in gold. The order had failed in its founding mission. Jerusalem was gone. Acre had crumbled. The pilgrims they once swore to protect no longer crossed the sea, but the Templars themselves had not vanished. They had adapted, and what they had become was something entirely new. A state without borders, a nation without a king. They owned no country, but they possessed vast lands, from the Scottish Highlands to the fields of Castile, from the vineyards of Champagne to the hills of Apulia. Their commanderies, fortified estates, dotting the map like stars. They collected rents. They managed farms. They raised livestock. They built mills. They taxed their tenants. And they answered to no crown. By papal decree, the Templars were accountable only to the Pope. No bishop could command them. No monarch could tax them. No court could summon them. They were immune, protected, unbound, and they were rich. Not merely in coin, but in systems. While kings struggled with primitive treasuries and local tolls, the Templars created something revolutionary, a pan-European financial network. A knight in England could deposit gold in London and receive a marked letter, a promissory note. He could ride to Acre or Toulouse or Rome and draw the same sum there minus a modest fee. The modern check, the modern transfer, the very notion of banking across borders, these were Templar inventions. Merchants used them. Nobles relied on them. Kings borrowed from them, including the King of France. The Templars loaned money to monarchs at a rate lower than any Jewish or Italian lender could offer. They charged interest discreetly, couched as fees or exchange rates, to skirt the Church's ban on usury. Their reputation for discretion made them the de facto bank of Europe. They held deposits for lords and abbots. They stored royal treasuries. They transported coin and documents between cities and across seas. Their castles became vaults. Their clerks became accountants. Their network, a web of trust and silence. And their power grew. Every province of the order had its own administration, priors, commanders, stewards. At the top stood the Grand Master in Paris, ruling from the order's fortified headquarters, the Temple. Below him, seneschals and marshals managed logistics and military training. Visitors traveled from house to house, inspecting for corruption, reinforcing discipline. It was a bureaucracy rivaling any kingdom. And yet, unlike a kingdom, it had no borders to defend, no peasants to please, no nobles to flatter. It existed in parallel with the nations of Europe and, in many ways, above them. The kings noticed. In London, the Templar preceptor held a seat in Parliament. In Castile, they controlled entire provinces. In Portugal, they advised monarchs. In France, they owned dozens of fortresses, including one just a short ride from the royal palace. They built ships. They conducted diplomacy. They carried papal mail and secret messages. They moved faster, spoke less, acted independently. They were respected. They were feared. Their seal still bore 2 knights on a single horse. But the poverty it once symbolized had long since vanished. The white cloaks remained, but the mission had changed. No longer defenders of pilgrims, they were now guardians of wealth, brokers of influence, and masters of a transnational enterprise. What had begun as a vow of poverty now owned vineyards. What had once been a vow of chastity now granted rooms of private quiet. What had once sworn obedience only to God now traded favors with kings. They had become what they had once sworn to renounce. They were not evil. They were not saints. They were something harder to define, necessary, efficient, untouchable. And in the eyes of monarchs desperate for money, that made them dangerous. In the next chapter, we will watch as the tides shift, as the kings grow bold, as the Pope grows quiet, and as one man in need of gold and glory reaches for the only treasure he cannot control, the temple itself. Chapter 5. The Fall of Jerusalem, the Rise of Power. When Jerusalem fell, the temple did not die. In 1187, Saladin reclaimed the holy city for Islam. The Great Cross was torn down. The knights who had once knelt before the Holy Sepulchre were either slain, captured, or driven to the sea. The Templars had failed in their original mission to protect the path to the holiest site in Christendom. But they did not disband. They retreated to Tyre, to Tripoli, to Acre. And when those cities fell, one by one, they returned to Europe. They brought no pilgrims with them, only ships heavy with documents, with wealth, with relics, and with memory. Jerusalem was gone. The kingdom of heaven had collapsed. But the temple itself, its structure, its power, its idea, was still alive. And it moved to Paris. There, in the heart of France, the Templars built their new headquarters, a fortress known simply as the Temple. It was not a monastery. It was not a castle. It was both and more. From this new center, they governed not a kingdom, but a network. Their commanderies stretched across the continent. Their financial systems pulsed with coin. Their ships sailed with diplomatic letters and merchant goods. Their loyalties were to no king, no border, only to their Grand Master, only to the Pope. And yet, they had rivals. Other military orders had also survived the collapse of the Crusader states. The Hospitallers, once caretakers of the sick, now held fortresses and fleets of their own. The Teutonic Knights, founded by German Crusaders, had shifted their war to the north, carving out territory from Baltic pagans. These orders competed for land, for recruits, for legitimacy. In the courts of Europe, their emissaries walked the same halls. In the ports of the Mediterranean, their banners flew from neighboring towers. And in the minds of kings and popes, their ambitions were weighed and measured. The Templars, with their history and myth, remained dominant, but their reputation began to fracture. Whispers arose that they were arrogant, that they acted without oversight, that they hoarded secrets and wealth, that they had grown proud, and perhaps they had. In France, they lent money to monarchs. In England, they advised royal councils. In Spain and Portugal, they managed borderlands and garrisons. They had become something the medieval world did not fully understand, a power not grounded in land or inheritance, but in loyalty, infrastructure, and ideology. They were not a state, but they behaved like one, and that made them dangerous. The kings, rebuilding after crusade and plague, saw the Templars not as saviors, but as competitors. Their independence, once their strength, became suspicion. Their wealth, once admired, became envy. Their loyalty to Rome, once holy, became political liability. And yet, the Templars did not reform. They did not retreat. They believed they were untouchable. They had survived Jerusalem. They had survived Hattin. They had survived the fall of Acre. Surely, they would survive politics. But they had misread the world. The 13th century had given birth to new powers, centralized monarchies, urban economies, printing charters, and royal taxes. The kings were no longer warlords. They were statesmen, and they needed control. The Templars, with their autonomy and their immunity, were now in the way. In the next chapter, the storm breaks. A king hungry for gold, a pope entangled in debt, a night of betrayal, and the first spark of the fire that would consume the order forever. Chapter 6. Philip the Fair and the End of Chivalry. Philip IV of France, Philip the Fair, was not a man of romance. His reign was not built on crusades or honor, but on numbers, on records, on gold. He was a king for a new age, precise, severe, and hungry for power. He ruled not with swordplay, but with bureaucracy, not with gallantry, but with ledgers. And in his ledgers, one figure loomed large: debt. France, like much of Europe, was bleeding coin. Wars, courts, fortifications, and the rising ambitions of kings had created a crown forever short of silver. To fund his government, Philip taxed clergy. He taxed merchants. He debased currency. He borrowed from Jewish lenders, from Italian bankers, and, most of all, from the Knights Templar. The temple had become the royal treasury. They stored his wealth. They moved his funds. They knew his accounts better than he did, and they charged less than anyone else. But what began as dependence curdled into resentment. Philip needed money, but more than that, he needed control. And the Templars, with their castles, their secrecy, their immunity, and their web of loyal brothers, stood outside his grasp. They were a kingdom within his kingdom, and that he could not allow. He had already crushed his enemies. He had broken the power of France's great lords. He had expelled the Jews and confiscated their property. He had seized church wealth in France and forced the Pope into submission. Now only one force remained beyond his reach: the papacy itself. Pope Boniface VIII believed in spiritual supremacy, that kings ruled by grace, and that grace flowed through Rome. Philip disagreed. He arrested the Pope's emissaries. He forbade the export of gold to Rome. He summoned the Estates General to declare national unity under the crown. When Boniface excommunicated him, Philip's men rode to Italy and seized him. Boniface died soon after, beaten, humiliated, and broken. In his place, under Philip's influence, rose a new pope, Clement V. Clement was French and pliant. In a gesture thick with symbolism, the papacy was moved from Rome to Avignon. The Bishop of Rome now ruled from a French city, under French protection, and in many ways under French control. This was the Avignon papacy, the Babylonian captivity of the Church. And it marked the moment when kings could make popes kneel. Philip had won. Almost. The temple remained. Wealthy, armed, independent, still exempt from taxes, still answering only to the Pope. Philip's next move would require precision. He began a campaign, not of war, but of accusation. He whispered of blasphemy, of heresy, of secret rites. He spread rumors of sodomy, idolatry, and witchcraft. He gathered confessions from disgruntled former members. He painted the Templars not as holy knights, but as a cult of darkness. He coordinated with Pope Clement, who, though reluctant, was cornered. And then on a single day, Friday the 13th, October 1307, Philip struck. Templars were arrested across France, dozens, hundreds, their houses raided, their treasuries seized, their brothers tortured. The Grand Master himself, Jacques de Molay, was taken in Paris. The charges were shocking: denial of Christ, spitting on the cross, obscene rituals, worship of idols, unnatural acts. Under torture, many confessed. And so began the trial. Not of individuals, not of crimes, but of an idea. The Templar order, the very notion of a warrior monk loyal only to Rome, was being erased. Philip claimed he was saving Christendom, but in truth, he was saving his crown. He had broken the Pope. He had broken the nobility. Now, he would break the last power beyond his reach. In the next chapter, we follow the unraveling, the trials, the tortures, the lies, the fire, and the last breath of a brotherhood born in faith and slain by fear. Chapter 7. The Arrest and the Trials. The Templars had always been feared in whispers. Now they were condemned in screams. What began as a single day of coordinated arrests on Friday, October 13th, 1307, unraveled into one of the most ruthless campaigns of defamation and destruction in medieval history. Within hours, the Templar order in France collapsed. Its members dragged from beds, from altars, from fortresses. They were imprisoned, isolated, interrogated, and tortured. The accusations were grotesque: denying Christ, spitting on the crucifix, kissing other knights in obscene places, worshipping a demonic idol named Baphomet, eating the ashes of dead brothers, consorting with the devil himself. It was a catalogue of nightmares, each more scandalous than the last. But it was not truth that mattered. It was theater. Philip IV, with the help of willing inquisitors, orchestrated a campaign not just of control, but of narrative. The Templars, once icons of Christian virtue, were recast as agents of darkness. Their red crosses, once symbols of martyrdom, now stained with the suggestion of perversion. Under torture, the confessions poured in. Some wept, some screamed, some died. Others broke and said whatever they were told to say: the rack, the strappado, the iron boot. The inquisitors used every tool at their disposal to force the order to collapse from within. The confessions were contradictory, confused, absurd. One knight claimed the idol of Baphomet was a severed head. Another said it was a wooden cat. Another that it was a bejeweled skull. But to the public, none of this mattered. The spectacle was complete. The guilt was assumed. The Templars were heretics. They were witches. They were enemies of Christ. And Philip had the church to back him. Pope Clement V, caught between loyalty to the crown and the gravity of the accusations, hesitated. But pressure mounted. Trials spread across Europe. In some countries, the order was defended. In others, it was quietly dissolved. But in France, the heart of the storm, the outcome had already been written. A grand council was convened. The testimonies were read aloud. Confessions forced under torture were accepted as proof. Evidence was burned. Witnesses silenced. And through it all, Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, remained imprisoned. He had confessed, then retracted, then confessed again. A man broken in flesh, but not yet in soul. For 7 years the trials dragged on. Property was seized. Castles handed over to other orders. The once mighty network of the temple disintegrated into ash and inventory. And then, in 1312, the end was made official. At the Council of Vienne, under papal decree, the order was dissolved. Not because it had been proven guilty, but because it had become impossible to defend. Its treasure officially transferred to the Hospitallers, its legacy buried under shame. But not everyone forgot, and not everyone forgave. In the next chapter, the fire rises. The final confessions are withdrawn, and a curse is spoken that will echo through the ages. Chapter 8. The Death of Jacques de Molay. The fire was prepared long before the flame was lit. By 1314, the Templar order had already been dissolved. Its lands had been seized, its coffers emptied, its reputation poisoned. Yet one symbol remained: Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master. He had led the order for decades, through war, diplomacy, and betrayal. He had survived sieges, commanded legions, and now, after years in chains, stood as the final thread tying the present to a forgotten past. And the king wanted that thread cut. On March 18, 1314, in the heart of Paris, 2 stakes were raised on the Île aux Juifs, the island of the Jews, named for the site of earlier executions. The Seine flowed cold beside them. A crowd gathered. The air was still. De Molay was brought forth with another Templar, Geoffroy de Charnay. Both had confessed under torture to the heresies assigned them. But now, facing death, they spoke with clarity. They retracted everything. "We are not guilty," de Molay declared. "Our only crime was obedience." The retraction changed everything. The planned sentence, imprisonment, was no longer politically viable. Heretics who denied their guilt could not be allowed to live. And so the sentence was changed: death by fire. Witnesses say the flames rose fast. The wood had been soaked. The air stank of pitch. Jacques de Molay, bound tightly, stood upright, unflinching. He did not scream. He did not beg. He stared into the crowd and raised his voice, not in protest, but in prophecy. "Pope Clement, King Philip, before the year is out, I summon you to the judgment of God." And then silence. The crowd watched as the fire consumed him. According to chroniclers, Pope Clement V died 1 month later, of illness or perhaps of fear. That autumn, King Philip IV fell from his horse while hunting. He died days later. His heirs would die young. The Capetian line would falter, broken by war, disease, and misfortune. The legend took root quickly. The curse of the Templars. A final act of justice. A final echo of a dying age. In truth, we cannot know what de Molay meant. Was it a threat, a warning, a prayer? But it does not matter. What matters is that the world believed it, and through belief, it became real. The fire on the Seine was not just a death, it was a funeral. Not for a man, but for a vision. The dream of a sacred brotherhood, unbound by kings, loyal only to faith, forged in the deserts of Jerusalem and broken in the streets of Paris. With Jacques de Molay died the idea of a warrior monk. With him died the last spark of the chivalric crusade. The temple was reduced to ash, and the future belonged not to saints, but to sovereigns. In the next chapter, we explore what remained: the myths, the treasures, the scattered survivors, and how an order destroyed in body survived in story forever. Chapter 9. The Legacy of the Templars. The flames died. The ashes cooled. But the Templars did not vanish. Not entirely. Though the order had been dissolved, though its members imprisoned or scattered, the echo of what it once was refused to be silenced. In taverns, in monasteries, in royal courts, and among the common folk, the name lingered. The temple had fallen, yes, but it had not been forgotten. Legends began almost immediately. That Jacques de Molay had cursed the king and the pope, that the Templars had hidden a vast treasure before the arrests, that ships had fled from French ports in the night, carrying gold, relics, or secrets to Scotland, to Portugal, to Cyprus, that the Holy Grail, the cup of Christ, was among their possessions. None of it could be proved. All of it endured. In Spain, the Order of Montesa was created. In Portugal, the Order of Christ emerged, adopting the Red Cross and much of the Templars' property. Prince Henry the Navigator would later sail under its banner, leading voyages that birthed the Age of Discovery. Were these orders truly Templar rebirths, or were they political masks, ways to repurpose assets while discarding the name? It mattered little. The symbolism survived. In Germany, the Rosicrucians claimed spiritual descent from the temple. In Britain and America, Freemasons adopted rites, titles, and myths that traced shadowy lines back to the Templar order. Across Europe, chapels, cathedrals, and tombs bore marks, crosses, circles, sealed doors that some swore were signs, and always the treasure. Countless tales told of hidden gold beneath Paris, of scrolls buried in Scottish crypts, of sacred geometry encoded in cathedral stones, of maps to lost worlds, of knowledge too dangerous for kings. The truth? Likely mundane. The order's real treasure was not gold, but structure, not secrecy, but discipline. They left behind the first international financial network, the first legally independent army, the first cross-border monastic corporation. Their downfall reshaped Europe. It showed kings that no power could be left unchecked. It showed popes that divine sanction could be bought. It showed the world that myth, when wielded correctly, could become law. But the Romanticism was too rich to ignore. Books were written, plays performed, later films made. The Templar cross became a symbol of mystery, of resistance, of hidden knowledge. In time, it lost its context and became pure icon. But beneath the fiction lay something real. A brotherhood had been destroyed. A new world had taken its place. And yet, in secret oaths, in whispered stories, in stained glass and stone, the ghost of the temple endured. In the final chapter, we will ask what it all meant, not just for history, but for us. why we return again and again to this tale of vows and fire, and what it reveals about power, belief, and the myths we choose to keep alive. Chapter 10. The Myth We Never Buried. History ends in silence, not in fire, not in blood, but in the quiet forgetting of facts and the loud remembering of symbols. The Knights Templar no longer exist. Their castles are ruins. Their archives are dust. Their names, once feared, are now sold on trinkets in airport bookstores. Yet we speak of them still. Why? Perhaps because they remind us of something we rarely admit, that power, even cloaked in faith, can devour itself. The Templars began as protectors. They walked beside pilgrims, offered swords in the name of God, slept by candlelight to keep temptation at bay. They were poor, focused, uncompromising. Their early vows were not just words but identities. But they grew, and in growth, they changed. They built networks, influenced kings, wielded coin like weaponry. They became untouchable until they weren't. The very architecture of their success became the scaffolding of their downfall. No crown tolerates a rival. No myth survives unchecked. We remember them not only because of their end, but because of what they became before it. A paradox. Holy warriors who financed empires, ascetics who managed treasuries, defenders of the cross who were branded heretics. The myth of the Templars is not a lie, it is a mirror. In them, we see our own institutions, how purpose twists into pride, how vision decays into ritual, how structure outlives meaning. Their fall is not unique, it is archetypal, and yet something in their image lingers. The white mantle, the red cross, the brotherhood, the silence. They stir the part of us that hungers for mystery, that wants to believe there is something hidden beneath the stones, a truth encoded in vaults, a treasure just out of reach, a knowledge lost not by accident, but by fire. So we revive them, in fiction, in conspiracy, in ceremony. Not because they are true, but because they speak to something true. That we are drawn to the disciplined, that we fear the unanswerable, that we crave stories that end in smoke. Jacques de Molay's curse did not rewrite history, but it left an imprint. Because in every era, there are those who grow too powerful, and those who burn them. In the Templars, we see both. This was not just a brotherhood, it was a question. What happens when faith is armed, when purpose is monetized, when myth becomes policy? There is no single answer, only silence and stone, and a name we still remember. The poor fellow soldiers of Christ, the Knights of the Temple, the order that would not kneel. And so we end, not with certainty, but with a closing door. Behind it, the past. Before it, our own reflections. The Templars are gone, but we have not buried their myth. Perhaps we never will. Thank you for joining us on this journey through time with Bedtime Lectures. If this story moved you, please subscribe, ring the bell, and share your ideas for the next lecture you'd love to fall asleep to. Good night and sleep well.